Good evening. You're listening live to the Xtreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Alongside me tonight, I have from the great Midwest, Mr. RDV himself, and I have, of course, Easy E, Eric Brain, something supreme. I don't even want to say it here online, but we're going to be talking about a late 1970s disco gem, Patrick Swayze's very first movie called Skatetown USA. You want to talk about a time capsule kind of movie, ladies and gentlemen, this movie's it. And guys, I will just start off by saying that I hadn't seen this in a very long time, and rewatching it, I was blown away by the total difference in the way people approached making movies for fun and enjoyment and entertaining, even B and C level crap like this, because this is perfectly dateable type movie. If you watch it and you say to yourself, were things really like that in the 70s and 80s and disco and all that?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, yes, and more yes. And that's what we're going to talk about here tonight, some of the stuff in it too. So I want to go around and just briefly mention how Patrick Swayze in his first film role was a competitive skater and a dancer trained. You guys that saw Ghost and Dirty Dancing all know this. Very, very likable guy. Got an incredible presence in this film. He's the bright spot in it, despite all the other crap that's in this. And there's definitely some backstory stuff that can lead into Playboy and other things that may not be as iconic as it once were. But RDV, you're the 30-something guy here too. You like a little bit of these types of movies, but yet you didn't grow up with them. What was your initial take?
Going into this, I felt like I was kind of watching a little bit of Caddyshack mixed with I'm trying to think what else. I mean, Grease. You can tell a little bit like just the times around this. The disco was a real big thing.
Yes,
79. I mean, not Porky's, but you kind of get a sense like this is going to be a slightly more adult movie because the sexual innuendos in here is actually really strong with this movie. And this is a movie you'll never see again today.
Exactly.
If you even know how highly it was like still tame, you'll never see this because people just cannot. People are just too uptight these days.
Well, you bring up a really good point that I think we're going to talk about here because, growing up in the 80s like myself, I only remember stuff from the kids' eyes in the 70s. And we lament the fact that when we look at 80s films, there's bush, there's boobies, there are all sorts of stuff as a juvenile, but the 70s were wild and crazy, and there was a different mentality when it came to sex and hijinks and all that too. And Easy E, I know you're a big 70s guy, Studio 54 player himself, so what was your take on this film?
I'm just wondering how I must have really drank a lot my senior year because I don't remember this.
No.
I found this last Saturday night after the auction. It just popped up on my YouTube feed, and I said, "What is this?" And I watched a couple minutes of it, and I'm like dumbfounded. I go, "How did this get by me?" But these movies, well, because there were a ton of them also in that era. And the best way to describe this would be like a farce comedy. And I think we really don't have those anymore, as RDV mentioned. I think the closest that we've gotten to them recently, I said, and it tell you how much they've changed, is something like The Hangover, where where there's just like one series of absurd situations that kind of lead to it. It's like one absurd situation leads to another, leads to the other, and then before you know it, you're out of film, so the movie ends. And if you got time to throw an ending in there, great. If not, because that's what it kind of felt like to this. Because I'm watching this and I get to the end, I go, they kind of forgot to put Marsha Brady in the end of this.
Well, she's coked out, so
even Horshack shows up at the end in the credit scene. He made it back to Skate Town, but Marsha's nowhere to be found. So it's just kind of like they just kind of end. I said, I had a blast. I thought this was a ball to watch.
Let's set the stage a little bit for what this movie is about, because obviously it's like I say, a time capsule period piece, and it's one of those few films that you go, wow, if I look at it through this lens, these kinds of things go on. And sexuality aside here, the 70s was an interesting decade too, because that was really kind of the decade of the director, if you want to think of it that way. And there's reasons why certain people are in this film, which we're definitely going to be diving into here in a moment. But you also had disco. You could argue that it was probably the greatest decade in terms of music, movies, just pop culture in terms of high output and quality, people touring and all that stuff, bands from the 60s maturing and playing. And that's not a knock on the 80s, which is my decade, but I would say the 80s was definitely running on fumes from the 70s. And here you have something that died a horrible, quick death, and that would be disco. And disco's often made fun of as not real music, but I will simply say that this soundtrack and RDV, again, you know, we can talk music with different things from different places. This was some really good music in there. Even if you don't like disco, the 1 and the 3s rather than the 2s and the 4s for rock and roll were prevalent. This thing is nonstop music. And the thing too about it is that's one of the reasons why it's hard to find a copy of it, because all the music rights and everything else, much like Beavis and Butthead. Yeah, but the whole thing about this is you got Skatetown USA, which is of course in Los Angeles, and if you look at this as a musical, then you understand musicals are going to be over the top, kind of goofy. They're going to be the film version of being overly dramatic on stage. And you have to accept it. It's its own little genre there. And with the success of things like Grease and blockbusters in the 70s, it was nice in a way that you could see something as dopey and silly as this, because let's be honest, Marsha Brady in here looked like every girl in the 70s. Dorothy Stratton, a Playboy Playmate of the Year that we'll talk about here, was involved with the director at the time, had a very interesting backstory, which we'll touch on here. Welcome back, Cotter. You had Horseshack in here, for God's sakes. You had a lot of known people in here. Flip Wilson. You had the vertically challenged individual from Foul Play. You had, oh my God, I totally forgot about this, Eric, but the unknown comic is in here. Jesus Christ. All these gimmick guys show up, and you know what? You almost never have a movie today, and RDB, this is your point that I'm sure you'll comment on here, where you can have just a bunch of people show up and do stuff. Maybe a little bit in Anchorman 2 or Anchorman, but not often, and usually it's just that group. But here it's like everybody that needed a bit role, hey, show up, let's make this movie. I mean,
and it was a straightforward movie. It wasn't like, you know, like it was the whole plot is basically these two friends gonna come there from the valley. They're gonna go win this contest and get this motor scooter, basically, you know, moped or whatever, and earn prize money. And you got this guy who's the local guy there, Ace, played by read your name, Patrick Swayze, not Rob Swayze. Although you probably make a better Patrick Swayze than Rob.
Ace.
Anyway, he's got his little skate gang here, like, you know, and they're down to, like, they got the moves. They're like kicking people off the skating ring. That's what I was like, what the heck's going on here? This is getting a little violent for a movie. Yeah, and it's just down those two, like, having a competition, you know.
It's
and
a skate off.
And Marsha Brady, you know,
it's all about the prize.
Stanley Bradford is the guy's name. You'll never hear that again, I guarantee it, unless you look for it. Unless you're looking for Zapped, that's his next movie. His sister, Marsha Brady, is like just boy crazy. That's her role. And it works for this movie because back then, as Brina put out, this is right where she's on the edge of being hot and then going out of being hot. Like she's at the age.
A tweener.
You know? Yes. Everything in this movie is like, you know, you had your little corny hijinks, but I mean, the soundtrack was great in this, and that could be another reason why. I guarantee that's why is you're not gonna see it anywhere. And it's probably rights that they lost rights to the movie or whatever, or maybe it just got burned like some of the other movies. You know, they lost the virtual film. But anyway, I was looking at the director for this. It's kind of funny. William A. Levy is the guy who directed this. Then a couple years later, 1984, we get the first debut of none other than one of our great martial artists that's on here, Jean-Claude Van Damme, in Monaco Fever Forever, where he plays a gay karate guy in the movie. Yep. I did not know this. I'm like, okay, because this is a movie I've never heard of. So I was looking up the director, and I was like, this guy, he's got to do some other than this. But yeah, he's got movies like Hellgate, Committed, and Lightning White Stallion, and then after '91, he's just gone.
Yeah.
But the big movie I noticed that was before this, a year later, or this is a year before, it was 2 years. The Happy Hooker Goes to Washington.
Sure.
So you can tell by this guy's directing career what you're going to get in this movie.
Well, let's bring up the obvious here. The sex
And it's
angle and the
roller
porn
disco.
scene. Well, yeah, roller disco isn't a nice way of presenting it, but like I had mentioned before a few weeks ago on one of our broadcasts when we talked about the adult film industry, that kind of mirrored mainstream films. And Eric, I know you can probably attest to this. Like I said, being a bit older from there in the 70s, that obviously in the early 70s, there were some changes in laws that allowed adult films to become a bit more accessible to the mainstream. But of course, at this point here, with movies were getting filmed, you had to have a source of these beauties. And of course, that was something that had been a brand for a long time and whose name has probably soured over the years, and that's Playboy. And so there's a scene in here of a blonde woman, Dorothy Stratton, who was Playmate of the Year. They were tying everything into it and all that. And as a kid in the early 80s, one movie that kind of floored me a little bit, and it's the first time I recall Eric Roberts, and it's a movie called Star 80, which as a kid, I go, I don't know if I understand everything that's going on here from the adult themes, but I get what was going on. It was a sleaze bag kind of thing, and a girl who meets somebody else. And it's kind of amazing because she had a very untimely end, which I sort of remember in the news there, but it shows you what a small world it is too, because the one name that, as a John Carpenter mark, as I have to point out occasionally, the person who came up with the story, none other than the shape himself, Nick Castle. So that's just something I went, wait a minute. When I'm watching the opening credits, when they're having these great little helicopter shots of people on Venice Beach and doing all their skating stuff, and yes, there always would be the one guy with the radio on his shoulder, zipping around and shirtless, and Canadian tuxedos too. Eric will vouch for this. When I saw Nick Castle, I went, really? Is it that small world? This guy actually did that too? And the answer, of course, is yes. I mean, Eric, set the tone for us in the 70s about just how penetrating disco was at this point.
Yeah, it was everywhere here. I mean, because it took over the mainstream. I mean, the punk kind of happened right around the same time that disco started getting big, but disco was the prevalent thing for the mainstream. So if you went to all of our high school dances, I mean, you heard songs in this movie that you heard at every dance you went to in the late 70s.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Boogie Town.
Yeah, with one notable exception, I have to point this out. When I looked at the credits, but I wasn't paying that close attention, so when the movie came on, I saw it was starring Scott Baio and Dave Mason. I said, "Oh wow, here's another Dave Mason." Nope, it was that Dave Mason, and I'm just picturing him on the stage singing the first song, going, 10 years ago, I'm in Traffic. Now I'm in Skatetown USA.
Traffic was a huge band. Steve Winwood was from Traffic as well,
Yes.
right? And this guy, you look at him and you go, oh, he looks like the one guitarist that's friends with Rick Beto on YouTube or whatever, and plays in Nashville, and he's smiling all the time, and it's so annoying, and he's done backup stuff, and then you go, no, this fucker can sing and play, and you're like, wow, holy crap. And he just doesn't look like it when you hear the voice, and you're like, they really got some names.
And he looked like, and by 1979, he looked like a finalist in a Be a BG member contest.
He had
one of the biggest records in 76. He went, when they broke up, he went solo. He had Alone Together, Let It Flow. None of it sounded anything like this, but a lot of people well, the Bee Gees were not a disco band.
No.
If you listen to their late 60s stuff, it's everything from psychedelic. I mean, they were like Beatlesque. I mean, they were, but that's where the focus was shifting. So the people that wanted to cash in went the disco route, and Dave Mason, I didn't realize until last week, or well, actually today, was one of them. And it was. But I'll get back to you in a second. RDV. The clothes, like I said, those of us that were in high school in the 70s, fashion was at its all-time worst, because the fashion for guys were everything from zip-up velour tops, shirts, to corduroy pants, silk shirts where the collars had to get out to the shoulders. Girls' fashion was god-awful. You couldn't tell pretty girls from not. I mean, you really couldn't. It was hard, with the exception of those shorts. I know I'm going to get called a sexist for this, but that was like the one thing that we guys had to look forward to is to see a pretty girl wearing those volleyball shorts, and those they were all over this movie. But it was, obviously unlike other. I mean, obviously the fashion was accurate because it was made in that time, but it, I mean, obviously everything was exaggerated for the purpose of this movie, but that is, if you gathered a group of people together, that's pretty much what they looked like, and it was. That's a lot of white guys wearing afros and were trying to, and just it was, it was something. It was kind of like I'm watching, and I'm 17 again. It's like, I was like, I know I might have missed this, but I know I saw a lot of other movies that were pretty much like this.
The one thing that's still today is if you ever went to any, because they still have roller rinks out for people. Don't eat the hot dogs.
Yeah.
The guy woke up, he was asleep, and he threw the hot dogs, just rolled them on the bottom there. Yeah, that's pretty much everybody knows you get yesterday's hot dogs.
Well, Ed's in chat talking about the browns and oranges and stuff. So kind of to be semi-serious here for a second, in the 70s, you had this big shift of consciousness supposedly about the earth. And a lot of people see all these hippies from the 60s had too much time to make up and care about stuff. And without diving deep in it, you saw a lot of that. And the one thing that was really prevalent too, besides these colors, was house plants. You'd see them everywhere and stuff. You would go to malls here in Central Florida and you'd have nothing but fountains, natural stuff, and plants. You don't get that now anywhere that you go. Everything's cold.
True.
And gray. Yeah, but that was a 70s thing. Definitely.
My mall used to have them in the early to late 90s. They finally took out they're basically wishing well pools. You throw your pennies in and all that stuff. They had those two, plus the plants around them. They got rid of them. They tore it out for whatever reason. So they put like a little auditorium in the middle that nobody ever uses.
Well, it's about square footage for all the stuff that's going on there too. But for
this, a lot of people would go get their food and they'd sit down on that ledge right there, by the fountains.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was a meeting place,
awesome.
and you would have that with the skating rinks too, where you would go. And one thing I want to mention about this movie too, because I mean, if I were to sum it up in a nutshell, besides it being a time capsule movie, is yes, this is Patrick Swayze's first movie, and he had been a dancer, professionally trained roller skater. There's another competitive roller skater in here, so. If I was just looking at this as a music person, just looking at everything to identify talent and all that, the one thing about Patrick Swayze, even though it sounds ridiculous, he plays the evil leader of the bad band that comes in there and challenges the other guy. So it's a big alpha versus alpha thing, even though it's about skating. It's like the old South Park episode where the dance crew comes up to Cartman and all that, and they step up to him, and so they don't do anything, so they get served, and then they try to step up back, and then they don't do it well, so it's on, and they don't understand all that, and that's the joke of the episode. It's like that in here, but the adult version of it using roller skates, because it's preposterous. But the thing that jumps out at you is this. Patrick Swayze is a decent-looking guy. He obviously knows how to move. He's very comfortable in his body. And I have to say this with all seriousness, Gene Kelly, it was probably the only other athletic, musical-type dancer that you get a heterosexual vibe from, too. And that's not a bad thing. But what I mean by that is the older style from back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was more of a prim and proper, stuffy old man type of dancing. And you think of someone like Fred Astaire. But then Gene Kelly came along and was a totally different take on it that, hey, it's okay if you're a guy, you can be masculine and also still be a dancer. And so that's kind of one of the things that happened in the 70s too, is, and you made the comment here earlier, RDV, about white people and afros, or Eric did too, about showing up. But you could go, and the disco thing was so easy that even if you couldn't dance, you could kind of stand there and go with your teeth out and feel like you belonged, and you had rhythm. And that was a big attractive thing. Besides, that's where people would go to meet and other adults and have sex too, because not everybody went to clubs and bars. They would go to disco nights and roller skating rinks. And Patrick Swayze just jumps off of the screen. Maybe it's a little bit of bias because we've known him from everything, but I have to say this: if you're really a Patrick Swayze fan, you notice when they have the rockets attached to the roller skates and the big race at the end when they bond, that you can see where he's getting a little bit of his Red Dawn training here in this movie. I was trying to say that with a straight face. No, it's pure goofiness. if you are under the influence of something or multiple somethings, that might make this a more pleasurable watch.
Yeah.
But it's not that far off from how it was back then, with, like I said, with the
So-
way people dressed and everything else.
So back then prices were different. So the prize money, because of the economy and stuff back then, 1979, the prize money was only $1,000. Where radio stations now you can win $10,000.
$1,000 in the late 70s though is probably 10,000 now, easy. Seriously,
Yeah,
that's huge money.
But if I may, I'd like to mention a couple things, like from like a not a historical perspective, but kind of like putting things in perspective. And when this came up, we touched on it before. You know, about the people that were placed in this movie for various reasons. This was, I believe, 1 year after Welcome Back, Kotter had ended. So Ron Palillo was trying to shed that Horseshack image, and that's why he's got the beard and the big afro. Yeah, obviously Maureen McCormick was desperate to shed the Marsha Brady thing. And Rob, one of the things, just by clicking that on, my YouTube feed got filled up with every after-school special kind of nonsense that Maureen McCormick was in. It's like when Sally said yes when she was playing the promiscuous side. And Dorothy Stratton was ticketed for stardom. It wasn't going to happen, even if she had lived. Because she didn't have the acting chops. I mean, she was like she had a sexed up role in a Buck Rogers episode. She was in this, and she was in a handful of other things like this.
Galaxina, some of the other ones.
Galaxina. She had a future as if movies in space with fembots had remained a thing, that would have been her future.
She is basically like a sex icon. That's about it.
Scott Baio was Chachi on Happy Days at the time, so he had a built-in gigantic fan base. And but then like they get to the rivals. The guy that played Stanley, he was obviously one of those guys that Hollywood was trying to make something out of.
Yep.
And Patrick Swayze was his first role, so they you notice in the credits they give him the introducing, which means they've got plans for him too.
Yep.
I think it's interesting that 10 years later, Patrick Swayze's on the precipice of superstardom.
Yep.
This other guy is gone, literally out of the business. He has not acted professionally since 1986.
It makes me wonder, like, why did he leave? Something's personal happened, or did he just
guys like him were a dime a dozen. He didn't have whatever that it factor is.
Wow.
He clearly didn't have it. But now, and one of the things that would have made this movie, I mean, this movie was a fun watch, but what would have made it almost a good movie is if the skate group, because they even came out and said, and Swayze at the end even said, "I tried to kill you." If they had toned that down to a little bit like, take care of, meaning get him out of the way, like the Batman TV series, like just get him out of the way, tie him up in a closet, or I tried to hurt you, because it made for a nice cheesy line at the end, because I'm the hero. But when you cross over from like trying to hurt somebody to like literally they act like these guys would kill you, that kind of took me out of the movie just a little bit. but then again, this was not a very good movie. It was a fun movie to watch, and it may become a guilty pleasure down the road. I'm gonna got on my favorites bar because Venkman taught me how to do that.
Yeah,
I'm gonna leave it there for a while because I might watch
it
again.
This is the movie. Now, was this a TV movie or was this in the theaters?
Theater.
It was a theater. Okay,
it did $2.35 million.
Because I'm looking at this as like, I wonder if because there's a lot of made-for-TV movies, but then again, this could have been cable for all I know, instead of being actual in theater.
Cable was still not that big in the late 70s. It was a thing, but it wasn't as penetrating as now how those things are.
Well, that would make sense why nobody's heard of it, though.
Your cable system would have had WOR and WGN and maybe TBS, and that's about it.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's some funny lines in this too, where Stanley is the main guy, Greg Bradford. He's checking out the girl, and she's just by herself, and he's like, "We can focus, we gotta win this contest. You can't focus on babes." And then here comes the girl, and starts kissing, and Chachi starts making out with her.
Well, I tell you, there was a scene in here because they have the ditzy blonde bimbo that has a problem with understanding what color tickets. Like, if somebody bought a ticket, they're allowed in this week, but it changes the color the next week.
Yep.
And that's important because that's when we see Swayze come in, rolling in with this crew, Horshack as his muscle. And it made me think then, and I'm serious for a moment when I say this because it's not something we've analyzed. And obviously they portrayed her to be the sexy blonde ditzy bimbo, and usually we've talked about with our classic movies that we've reviewed here, the blondes are always the femme fatales, generally speaking, going back to the 30s and 40s. Raymond Chandler had a field day with blondes, but I wondered how early on in film, it's got to probably be in the 70s here, I don't know about the 60s, where people said, you know what? We're going to have this ditzy, dumb, sex pot blonde, and that's going to be her role because she's sitting there and she had the big eyes and the stupid voice and twizzling her hair a little bit too. And by the 80s, everybody, noticed that. But I'm going, hey, this is 79. When did this really start? Because you get these kind of ideas about things, and it has that musical flavor to it in that it wasn't just the music, but it was, this group versus that group competing over something. And, the only thing that might be like that today would be Fast and Furious, the first movie or two where they'd have some sexy chick at the beginning waving the flags for people to race. And here it's the motorized roller skates or whatever with the engines on them. It's just ridiculous. But you notice that, yeah, it is a musical, but the way they do some things are a little bit different. So, ultimately, the bottom line is this. It's not a great film. I agree totally. It's actually pretty much a piss poor, crappy one. It's still captured, I think, though, a little bit of just having fun and enjoying it, which we've said before here on the Xtreme Movie Show that somewhere along the way, going into probably the 90s, movies, a lot of them generally stopped being fun or entertaining. Yeah. And it was more the exception rather than the rule. And even though this is a throwaway film for everybody involved and people partied for a couple weeks, did a lot of drugs, screwed around and all that, and they're maybe embarrassed about it now on the resume, who cares? It was still, you can tell they were having fun doing it. And it reminds you of like the 70s and 80s sexual hijink type movies out there. Canada had a lot of them. There's definitely a, Eric, you would probably know this more than RDV. It has a bit of a National Lampoon's feel to it almost. So it definitely gets that right, which I'm glad it did. It's not a movie that just stops about 10, 15 minutes and you go, wow, they ran out of gas. It's the same movie from the start to the finish, and that's not always easy to do.
So apparently, 29 years, there was an article at Maureen McCormick. It said after this, she said, well, filming this movie, a lot of people were openly doing cocaine on the set. So she ended up getting addicted to cocaine, relapsing. And then Scott Bale said he blocked this movie, because it was made by a guy who didn't want to make a movie. It was a horrible time on set, everything. But the interesting part, I was reading about the trivia about this stuff. You can check it on IMDb and Wikipedia and stuff. It's really cool. Patrick Swayze, apparently he was into competitive roller skating before this.
Yes.
That's why he was able to do all the dancing on there. And then April Bowen is the name of the girl that was uncredited skating with him. She had won women's skating championship. So you actually have talented people, and I think I think that's why Swayze went on to do more stuff where the other guy didn't, because Swayze was actually more talented outside of acting too. I mean, he was able to do more things. So,
also, there's that look. There's a presence. There's an it factor that goes back to the beginning of movies where silent actors couldn't make the transition when they went to sound because when they had to do more than just stand there and look pretty, they couldn't adjust. And whatever. No one knows what that is. If we did, there'd be a lot more giant stars. But that's the difference between those two characters. There was nothing wrong with the other guy's performance. He was fine in this movie, but whatever it is. But Robbie, you're talking. One of the things I remember. Do you remember Carol Wayne?
I believe so.
She was a frequent guest on the old Carson show, playing that character in sketches.
Oh, okay. Yes. And
I'm thinking that might have been a prototype for what the Judy Landers of the world ended up bringing into movies, because that was a pretty big thing for a while. Again, you'll never see it because we're not allowed to laugh at anybody other than us now. But just as a quick aside, Patrick Swayze's sister in the movie, the one that ended up dancing with Stanley. She's been a major character on a soap called Bold and the Beautiful.
Old and beautiful.
Yeah, she's been for probably close to 30 years now.
So I want to quickly point out, because I don't want this to be confused. It's not roller derby. Competitive roller skating is pretty much what you see people do on ice skates, dancing stuff. So that's what they do in this movie, is competitive roller skating. And Swayze had done this before as a teenager. And that's why he was able to do all the dancing moves he was in this movie.
Well, there are a lot more what we would call, and ESPN picked up going into the '90s, extreme sports that were side things too. We talk about skateboarding was definitely a huge thing, and a lot of times when things would catch on in the '70s, sports-wise in certain areas, and California at the time was a hotbed for a lot of those little things. They would go somewhere else there too, boogie boarding. BMX racing. That's not that kids didn't have bikes or whatever, but becoming an athletic event, a thing, was like that. And so sometimes you would get something like, say, roller skating, where, okay, how can we make this a stream? How can we take it to the next level? How can we get people to know how to do it? Well, we talked about before, one of the movies we'll be doing at some point here on the Xtreme Movie Show, a breakdancing movie called Break-In that's got JCVD in the background and all that. But that was a thing. It was a big deal. And disco pretty much died very quick, and there was a lot of hatred about, like, how dare mainstream people really like it when it does get a bad rap. But then something else would have to fill in its place for mainstream audiences, and then all of a sudden the '80s movies, totally different than the '70s. And you can argue whether you like that style or not, but by the early '80s too, when you had rap and you had urban music changing and everything else there too, you still had a lot of good music, but synthesizers got a lot more mainstream, even though they're around in the '70s. It's just there's this just drastic change that made the '70s almost unrecognizable. So much so that you go, oh wow, here's a guy named Ted Nugent that was really popular in '70s touring and all that, and now he's got nothing going on. He shows up in an episode of Miami Vice, but then Miami Vice itself was very different for a TV show. So it definitely is interesting, because the late '70s, even Kiss, the rock band, did Kiss the Meets the Phantom of the Park, which is awful, awful, awful. It is unwatchable, but somehow you're hypnotized, mesmerized, and you want to sit down and watch it, especially when you're young, because their gimmick was so big. Same thing with Alice Cooper, for that matter. And it's not to say they don't have talent, but it's just a bit different from, like, if you watch things in the '60s and '70s, how much it changed. And this movie definitely captures the cheesy side of it.
My niece, and it's a big thing where we live out. We still have, which you saw in this movie, skating rings like this and all the stuff they have. That's not sometimes they play disco, but a lot of times they play the new stuff, music stuff too. You get the arcade on the side, you get the popcorn and all the stuff you get. Last time I was there, like 3 or 4 years ago. There's still championships for what they did in this movie, contests. Roller skating dancing contests up. Like, there's actually a league for it.
Yes.
I didn't realize it was still going on. It's still popular.
There's pinball competitions. There was always arcade competitions. There was all sorts of these minor things. Mini golf tour, there was one, and may still be around. I mean, all these little things that you just don't think exist. You just have to amplify them to 100 and go, I bet there's a niche market for it. It's just that in the '70s, unless you were physically active going and in the scene, you'd only know about it from word of mouth. It's different now when you can Google everything.
Yes, because as I said, my nieces for birthday parties always wanted to go there because you could get pizza and you just skating, something to do.
Yeah. Well, let's not forget
the
too,
difference
Eric,
between
the ABC's Wide World of Sports would have a lot of these little goofy things on it too.
Right.
Remember that?
Go ahead, Eric.
No, their niche now, and the reason why they were huge then was, you think about this, and it's easy to forget now. In those days, if you wanted to do something, if you wanted to see something, you had to get off your backside and go to it.
No streaming. No
movies, or sit at home and read a book. So I said, everybody was out doing things in those days. And I said, it was, I always bring up, I said, you notice what you didn't see were a lot of out of shape people.
No.
You ever see that picture of somebody took a picture of a crowded beach in 1970?
Yeah.
Fat people. Right. Because, now 50 years later of sedentary lifestyle, processed food, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, it's just,
you're correct though, because but the whole thing you acted because you wanted to get out of the house.
Right.
You only had one TV and your dad watched it.
Yeah, right. And now I would say, Rob, you were mentioning how big disco was. And to put in perspective, 2 words: emotional rescue.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And in case you need some, back for that, that was the Rolling Stones doing their disco record. That's how big it was.
He did a song in here. Mick Jagger wrote a song, but somebody else covered in the soundtrack. If you listen to the movie, there was a Rolling Stones song in here.
Well, you would have people that would take something and they would just add, like I say, the 103, and then you put it to a beat, boom, it's a disco song just because of the beat. And that's where even Kiss did it with their one song, "I Was Made for Loving You," which is one of their biggest hits. And despite the fact they did it as a lark to say, oh, anybody could do disco. I mean, disco got a bad rap because it got so hot so quick. A lot of people just said, well, this sucks.
When they filmed this at some dance hall, which is different, but the actually was based off an actual huge West Hollywood in West LA. There was a huge, I guess, like you said, skate ring like this.
Yeah,
it was very frequently popular. And dude, if you could go there, you could hang out, you could meet girls, you can be active, because that's what you wanted to do. You wanted to get out of the house now, because you're at that age where you couldn't really go out and go buy alcohol. You're still under. Well, then again, think about it. 1979, you could. If you're 18, you could. But if you're like 16, 17, yeah, you're 16 or 17 years old. You're gonna go here and you're gonna try and meet girls your age. And of course, you had girls like Marsha who were into guys who are older than her.
That's all women.
Yeah, so that's all women. Like I said, I agree. There was no YouTube. If you had a TV, your dad was watching it, and you had to watch what he wanted to watch, or you didn't watch anything else. Or you'd go out. A lot of people would just go out to hang out with their friends. You see the Stranger Things and go on their bicycles and hang out. That's what you did.
You know what your dad was probably watching, Mac?
He was watching Redford.
No, he was probably watching the Celtics with Bill Russell.
Yeah, rest in peace, Bill Russell, who died today. I hated the Celtics so much so, and I hate Larry Bird the most because I was a big Laker guy. But here's the thing: in the 70s and 80s, and I will say this too, as we kind of start closing up here a little bit, some sports you could argue were really peaked in the 70s and 80s in terms of not just basketball, but football, the quality of it. And I liken that to what's going on with movies and television, even at the time, and everything else there too. So there's this argument, pop culture wise, that probably was the peak. And I jokingly say here on the Xtreme Movie Show that, it really started cresting down in the 80s and 1985. It was just a big downhill spiral that we've never recovered from. But with Bill Russell passing in sports, it makes you wonder there too. It was a thing to be watching a sporting event live, not just in person, but also on television, and it meant more. And like today, when we have about 5 to 10 times as much media being produced, and we don't have 5 to 10 times as many people, you're by just laws of economics or whatever you want to call it, the more stuff you have, you're going to have a lot more crap. And unfortunately, that's kind of the world that we're in. And that's why we do the Xtreme Movie Show, where we actually talk about interesting films. But here's the thing: you even saw it in their clothes. So the comment about people being skinnier and younger, there's definitely regardless of how coked up or high they were during filming, all of them, even though a lot of them are very small people because they're not very big, and Hollywood still is kind of that way today, there's still almost, I hate to say this, almost an innocence about how they look too, because people dressed better. And people have only gotten worse, since, say, World War II, as far as their level of dress and quality. But in the 70s, despite how ugly the earth colors may have been, the clothes are more European style. Meaning they're more form-fitting. And if you're a little skinny, which a lot of people were, and that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, it just looked right. So you had a little bit more of the exaggerated shoulders and lapels and all that stuff too. But this was one of those things where there was a certain look and aesthetic to it, which unfortunately, I think in the 80s started to go downhill, because then you had the punk thing where people dressed in an alternative manner, which if that's your style, that's great too. But earrings got more accessible mainstream wise than tattoos than you would see in the 70s. But this is just when kids looked like kids, or young adults looked like young adults. And now it's like, I don't know, everybody looks like they're from prison.
There's I just also, for those who watch soap operas, one of the girls who played Allison in this movie went on to be in big star, Catherine Kelly Lang.
Where were you 5 minutes ago when I said that?
I was looking up other things.
I literally said she's been in the Bold and the Beautiful for 30 years.
Well, before that, she was in Young and the Restless.
All right, well, let's go around for final thoughts there on Skatetown USA there. I think we pretty much covered a lot of it. RDB, any other thing comes to mind?
That I want to watch Zap next for our next review. It's gonna be-
That's one vote for Zapped and one vote only.
No, this is a good movie. Despite what we consider to be good today. I mean, I was entertained by it. It's a culture, time capsule movie, and sometimes you gotta watch those movies every once in a while because you forget the little things like that people used to do back then. Girls used to be girls, guys used to be guys. It was a fun time. Now we're asking what everyone is.
You are. I'm not. I just guess.
You can't guess in 2022 anymore. You just stop trying.
Eric, final thoughts on Skatetown USA? Anything at all?
Yeah. In my DVR right now, I've got about 7 or 8 movies that I've started and I've gotten anywhere from 10, 15, 20, 40 hour into, and they're just sitting there waiting for me to get back to. I turned this on today, and I was kind of cheating because I knew I was going to be doing this tonight if I finished it, but I just didn't want to stop watching. I mean, because I don't have the patience. I mean, I've got a short attention span for sometimes movies will take me 3 or 4 sittings. This was just fun. Just like it just kept, you get through with one absurd scene and another one starts, and it was just, I said, there's this movie I don't think aimed to do anything but be a fun 90-minute diversion from whatever else you were doing. And as I said, so in that regard, it achieved its objective.
It's funny you say that because at some point when we go to do another Netflix or What's Playing review that we occasionally do here on Xtreme Movie Show, I recently started watching something like Keep Breathing or something on Netflix that has an incredibly hot ethnic woman in there, and she's survives a plane crash in Canada, and it's about her trying to survive, or at least so I thought, because the only thing that kept me watching was her and her wife beater and swimming around and all that, because she's extremely attractive. I thought, hey, survival woman, Canada, it's got all the things you'd like, right? But then it's really not about her surviving. It's about her having flashbacks to her failed relationships and how she deals with them all. And I'm like, boring. And it's like Stranger Things has turned into, and a bunch of other stuff on television, is that instead of reducing the amount of hours to film it, they're trying now to fill in stuff with everything. So the pacing can be so damn slow, not deliberate or particular, like a Ty West film might be. But you're right. This movie is very watchable because the pacing is there. And a lot of things now get drawn out where they don't need to be. Instead of 10 episodes, it could be 6. This is a movie that you're watching. It's a short 90 minutes, but a lot happens and it moves fast. It doesn't set up the characters in Act 1 and then do something in Act 2 and have a grand finale in Act 3 like every other James Bond film that we talk about here. It moves. It's quick. It's fun. And it's very digestible. And I have to give it credit for that because, as RDV and I have talked about, it's hard to find films like that today.
It is.
And one other thing real quick, it helps to be a certain age, and you see, like when Marie McCormick comes on screen. Oh yeah, I've seen every Brady Bunch. You see Ron Polio. I've seen every Welcome Back Kotter. Ruth Buzzy. Oh yeah, every Laugh In. And so if you've got that, because one of the cool things about watching these movies is where you've seen these people before, especially if you're old enough to have seen them as they aired. Because I'm old enough to have seen Brady Bunch as it aired, and everything else that I just mentioned, which does give me an advantage as far as like more reasons to like this movie. But I think anybody that watches it, even without that, will have fun for 90 minutes.
Yep.
I mean, if you know who Billy Barty is, you watch Space City Rollers. You show.
He's the vertically challenged individual.
Yes.
Yeah.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Skatetown USA, Patrick Swayze's first movie. Check it out. His name is Ace, and Ace is on the spot there too. It's a time capsule kind of movie, and partake in some indulgences if you were as an adult, and however you choose to watch it, you might get a certain sense of fondness back from it, or might just go, what the hell was going on there, and why don't we have it now if you're younger? So there you go.
Yeah.
I'd like to thank Easy for Eric Breen showing up tonight. Of course, RDV, as always, will be with me on Tuesday night when we go to review something else too. So check out the link that's going to be for the movie for that. As always, have a good night, everybody. Stay extreme.
Good night.